Hello and welcome, dear friends. Today we are going to discuss an important topic, that is Marxism. The objective of the lecture is to introduce Marxism to you and discuss the various ways in which Marxists relate to literature and culture. The lecture is divided in two parts. The first part is about Karl Marx and early 20th century orthodox Marxists, and the second part will be about neo-Marxism or Western Marxism in the 20th century. I start with the assumption that behind every approach to literature and culture underlies a philosophy of life, a perspective on life, that is, a way of looking at the world. As one should first understand why people think or feel in a certain way before one agrees or disagrees with them, let us first attempt to understand Marxism and then decide, each one for himself or herself, whether one should use it to appreciate and evaluate literature. As a caution, I may add here that it is possible to use certain Marxist concepts even if one disagrees with the overall Marxist worldview. Marxism, as the word itself suggests, is primarily, though not exclusively, associated with the writings of Karl Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883, and his friend and collaborator Friedrich Engels, who lived from 1820 to 1895. The word has been interpreted so diversely right from the beginning that Marx himself once said that he was not a Marxist, thus implying that even in his own lifetime, people had interpreted him in ways he himself would not subscribe to. So, before we look at various Marxist thinkers, let us look at Marx himself. Marx's writing career spans over more than 40 years, and as such, one finds in him, as in every other great thinker, conflicting ideas and observations. Interpreters of Marx are divided on whether he presents a coherent, unified worldview or is full of contradictions. He has written a number of works, the major ones being economic and philosophic manuscripts in 1844, a contribution to the critique of political economy in 1859, the German ideology published in 1867, though written earlier, and Capital in 3 volumes, with the first volume published in 1867. The one work, however, that I feel everyone, including a non-specialist, should be familiar with is the Communist Manifesto, written jointly with Engels in 1848, a fascinating but easy to read book, a must read for anyone who wants to understand Marxism. In 1840s, Marx employs words like species being and alienation to explain historical developments, while in his later writings, concepts like use value and exchange value are used, with focus shifting from man to the ensemble of social relations. Interpretations apart, I think the key Marxian ideas are contained in the manifesto. Opens with the oft-quoted line, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles." While Marx and Engels are seen as having made seminal contributions to the disciplines of political science and economics, I believe theirs is a comprehensive worldview touching all aspects of life, nature, and culture. Though born in the 19th century, they share the 18th century Enlightenment worldview with focus on science, reason, and progress. I will try to to identify a few chosen ideas that I believe are essential to Marx and Marxism. These are materialism, a progressive view of history, and the dialectical process, which sees conflict as a necessary and integral part of man's social evolution. That's why many earlier thinkers looked at Marxism as a combination of dialectical and historical materialism. Materialism. Marx was a confirmed materialist, concerned with this world and this life. Consciousness was seen as not primary, but an attribute of highly developed state of matter that man was. Marx adds that it's not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. We know that Renaissance onwards, Western civilization moved from a God-centered world to a man-centered one. The medieval belief that what mattered was God and heaven, and that this world was only to be used as a means to enter an eternal world, was gradually losing its force. Marx was a younger contemporary of Charles Darwin, and both implicitly attacked religion. Darwin with his theory of evolution, and Marx with the belief that man was a social or class construct and not a product of some divine design. To him, religion was opium of the people, in that it comforted us by illusions. History. Marx believes in the linear progressive view of history, in contrast to the cyclical view of history that Hinduism adheres to. The West largely goes with the biblical linear view of history, beginning with creation and ending with the judgment day. However, Marx supplements the linear view with a belief in progress, which for an Enlightenment-inspired thinker meant material progress. Marx, like Darwin, was concerned with man's evolution, but while Darwin was concerned with the biological evolution, Marx concerned himself with social evolution. He focused on labor as the key thing that defines us as humans and believed that human beings survive and progress through interaction with other human beings. To him, production of goods that we need to sustain ourselves physically was the key element, and the way we engage with others during the productive process defines the type of social formation we live in. Social formations keep on changing, moving from simple to more complex ones. The changes that take place in history are not random, but follow certain logic, or what may be called the laws of social development. Marx claims to have learned about the principles governing these laws from his intensive study of history in the British Museum. He states that man as a social entity starts with life in primitive communities and then goes through various stages of social evolution, or what he calls the modes of production, like the slave society, feudalism, and 19th century capitalism. Having analyzed the historical development in the West till the 19th century in a very convincing and painstaking manner, Marx applies to future what he learned about the laws governing the evolution of social formations. He guesses that the next stage in human evolution would be socialism, progressing further to end up in communism, a utopian world of freedom, after which history would cease to exist. To him, class conflict, that is, the conflict of the haves and the have-nots, is the motor of history. And with no classes in the ideal communist society, there will be no need for any further social development. dialectical process. Taking the idea of dialectics from G. W. F. Hegel, Marx believes that something in motion is better understood by dialectical logic, which sees conflict as something not inherently negative, but as an essential element of historical progress. Hegel believed that we arrive at superior ideas when an idea comes into conflict with its opposite. In the dialectical process, a thesis comes into conflict with its antithesis, with the two evolving into a synthesis. Marx replaced the Hegelian notion of ideas with matter, including social formations. For example, trade unions are not found in agricultural societies, but in the capitalist mode, the exploitative control of the working class by the capitalists in the 19th century is the thesis generating its antithesis, the emergence of trade unions. The conflict between the two leads to a synthesis in a higher type of social formation known as socialism. It is through this dialectical thesis, antithesis, synthesis logic that social formations have evolved in history. Modes of production. Being concerned with this life and this world, Marx believed that all societies, agricultural or industrial, are organized around the production of the means of sustaining life. The formations get their shape and form on the basis of the means and technology available for production. If the feudal society uses land as the main means of production, with the landlords as the ruling class, capitalism uses capital as the main means of production, with the capitalist as the ruler and the working class as the ruled. The conflict, implicit or explicit, is between those who own the means of production and those who labor on them without owning them. Surprisingly, the one who labors but does not own is economically disadvantaged, leading to inequality. The have-nots, however, continue to be the part of an unequal setup because they share the ideas of the ruling class. Marx wanted to understand what the reasons for inequality among humans were. Socialists in the 19th century believed that wealth and property should be equally distributed and that inequality was inherently unethical. Marx was not a socialist in this sense. He called himself a scientific socialist, in that he felt that socialism was inevitable because of the laws of social development and not because some of us desire it. He visualizes the Western societies as going through 6 modes of production, starting with a society of scarcity in primitive communism and culminating in a utopian society of plenty in communism. All modes except the last one are characterized by a conflict or struggle between the class that owns the means of production and the have-nots who do not own but work on those means. Marx is not against any mode, including the capitalist one, because he believes that a later mode is always superior to the preceding one. Capitalism, for example, is a very progressive mode when compared to feudalism, which it replaced, but becomes a conservative and regressive mode when compared with socialism, the emerging mode that it was trying to resist. The relations of production refer to how the haves and the have-nots relate to each other. The relationship is outwardly peaceful till the time the means of production change because of technological development. With new means of production, new relations of production are required, and this is usually possible only through a revolution. The class that is the main agent of bringing in the revolution is the class that was a have-not in the earlier setup, but will be the have in the new mode of production. Marx felt that in the 19th century, the agent of revolutionary change was going to be the proletariat, the working class. Marx accepted the capitalist mode of production as a necessary part of historical development that would be replaced soon by socialism. At the same time, he was critical of this transitional necessity because it resulted in alienation and commodification. In capitalism, man feels alienated from the objective world because of the advanced stages of the division of labor and private property. In the 19th century assembly line-based capitalist industry, man experiences a separation from the products of his labor, and this leads to his unprecedented alienation. As a capitalist uses the worker as a mere instrument in the production of value, the worker is reified or just becomes a thing. Marx makes a distinction between use value and exchange value. While the use value of an object is linked to the amount of labor spent on it and the material uses to which it can be put, the exchange value has little to do with labor. Surplus value is equal to the new value created by workers in excess of their own labor cost, and it is appropriated by the capitalist as profit when products are sold, leading to more exploitative inequality. Base determines superstructure. In all modes of production, materials and processes directly responsible for production, like slave labor, land, or capital, that is, the economic factor, is termed as base, while superstructure is defined as the world governed by ideas like the world of religion, politics, laws, art, and culture. Orthodox Marxism, or vulgar Marxism as it is called by its critics, believes that Marx and Engels gave us the base determines superstructure formula, which implies that religion, laws, and culture are directly dependent on the type of economic base they emerge from. Literature is thus seen as determined by the economic factor, and almost all early Marxists subscribe to the reflection model of literature. The author is seen as constructed by age and the social class he comes from. Ideology. Though the word ideology has no single meaning in Marx and is open to interpretation, Marxism is often associated with it. The largely accepted meaning is that it is a type of distorted and false thought or false consciousness, a result of idealism or capitalism. As the manifesto puts it, quote, "The ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class," unquote. Marx also uses ideology in the sense of a set of opinions, beliefs, and attitudes of a social class. In the reflection model of literature, literature can only reflect ideology, but we know that Marx was a great admirer of writers like William Shakespeare, Balzac, and Charles Dickens, because he felt that great writers are able to transcend their class ideologies or the ruling ideology. In spite of what they may believe at the conscious level, they are instinctively able to give us truths about life. the way a Marxist thinker does rationally. They are able to penetrate the superficial surface reality to something deeper. Marxism after Marx. Based on his understanding of history, Marx had prophesied that the socialist revolution will take place in an industrial society. The revolution, however, happened in 1917 in Russia, an agricultural country. As such, many people argue that Marx has proved to be wrong, particularly more so as capitalism is still around and doing well even in 2018. One should, however, understand that Marx was not a rigid thinker and had felt that we need to be constantly learning and analyzing. The world learned a lot from Marx, and capitalism itself has changed its nature drastically in the last 200 years. After the 1917 revolution, Russian society witnessed dramatic changes in the ownership of means and the relationship between classes. Lenin made certain major modifications in Marxism, leading to what is known as Marxism-Leninism. Russia, being mainly an agricultural country at that time, Lenin's Russian Revolution was staged not by the proletariat or the working class, but by a combination of the peasants, the working class, and the intellectuals. The leaders focused on political and economic control and power, but literature too was discussed by thinkers like Vladimir Lenin, Leon Trotsky, George Plekhanov, Anatoly Lunacharsky, and others. Though many ideas were explored, the official Soviet doctrine on literature was announced only in 1934, by which time Joseph Stalin had consolidated his power. With new classes taking power, the issue of what to do with literary classics was an issue much debated. Lenin, like Marx, seemed to be in favor of retaining the classics, but many others thought of the need for a new type of literature which would further the party interests. While in practice, the avant-garde futurists were popular and Russian formalism emerged as a key literary theory, there were others who looked at the problem from a revolutionary angle. One such group was Politcult, which wanted to change the existing artistic forms by creating a new working class aesthetics or proletarian culture. The new class that was emerging because the agrarian society was being transformed into an industrial one wanted a culture that did not have much to do with earlier writers like Tolstoy, who represented the interests of classes that had lost power. A more radical group was RAP, Russian Association of Proletarian Writers, which encouraged censorship of literature on ideological grounds. With Stalin consolidating his power, the Congress of Soviet Writers was held in 1934, which promulgated socialist realism as the official Soviet doctrine for creative writers. It wanted writers to write for the working class and include scenes of everyday life. Writing had to be realistic and also support the aims of the state and the party. It was to be suffused with hope, heroism, and optimism, and was to avoid unhappy endings. The 1930s saw Marxism as a major force not only in Soviet Russia but all over Europe and even in the US because of the 1929 economic depression. Marxist thinkers and activists could be found in the whole of Europe before Hitler and Mussolini took over Germany and Italy. In 1930s, which is also described as the decade of the left, England saw literary critics like Christopher Caldwell, Ralph Fox, and Alec West, most of them influenced by Russian Marxism and economic determinism. Looking at early British Marxist literary critics like Christopher Caldwell, one finds that they rely on one-to-one correspondence between the base and the corresponding superstructure. Caldwell is appreciative of capitalism in its early stages, as it was a positive and progressive mode compared to feudalism. That helped in the emergence of great writers like Shakespeare and Cervantes. Caldwell, in Studies in Dying Culture, however, rejects modernist literature as it is seen as directly connected to capitalism in its last stage, the stage of decaying capitalism that resists the emergence of socialism. Karl Radek, the Russian, had dismissed James Joyce's Ulysses as, quote, a heap of dung crawling with worms, unquote, because it had, quote, no big events, no big people, no big ideas, unquote. Even George Lukács, in his essay, The Ideology of Modernism, is critical of modernism because he argues that the modernist writers wrongly presented alienation and meaninglessness as universal and eternal truths, ignoring the fact that these were a product of the capitalist society in early 20th century. Lukács was dismissive of modernism and its forms like expressionism because these led literature away from the needed contact with the objective reality. In an article on Thomas Mann versus Franz Kafka, Lukács rejects Kafka in favor of Mann, a realist. George Lukács, 1885 to 1971, is a Hungarian Marxist who spent his life in both Hungary and Soviet Union under Stalin. Among his famous works are History and Class Consciousness in 1923, the historical novel 1937, and The Meaning of Contemporary Realism 1963. He is seen as the bridge between orthodox and neo-Marxism. Lukács wanted a literary text to be close to objective reality, catching not its surface but its essence. He has taken the idea of appearance-essence dichotomy from Hegel. He felt that realism was a mark of great literature and made a distinction between naturalism and realism, in that while naturalism was like a photograph capturing the surface reality, realism was able to penetrate the surface to reach the underlying truths. Lukács felt that in 19th century capitalist world, Balzac was a critical realist while Zola and Flaubert were naturalists. In 20th century, with the development of working class consciousness, socialist realism was to replace critical realism. Marx on literature and culture. Though Marx and Engels were not literary critics or theoreticians, certain ideas, passages, and quotations by them that pertain to literature have been collected in a book, Marx and Engels on Literature and Art, by Leo Baxendale and Stephen Moravsky. Marx was brought up on humanist ideas and literary classics, but his politico-economic concerns took him into new directions. He had to deal with the tension between creative freedom and social responsibility, between beauty and political commitment, and between aesthetic and cognitive and moral functions of art. Marx had said that art is as much about self-creation as it is about self-discovery. It creates the very senses by which it is enjoyed. It is a result of specifically human needs, which it both creates and strengthens in the very act of gratifying them. But Marx was a practical thinker, a believer in praxis, and not just an armchair philosopher. In his 11th thesis on Feuerbach, he also says, quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." Unquote. It is for us to judge whether writers only reflect the world or help us change it. Let me conclude. Karl Marx and early 20th century orthodox Marxists believed that we could hasten or slow the progress of history towards what is inevitable, a communist utopia, not because it was ethically necessary, but because that is what was bound to happen. Technological development will result in a society of plenty where class conflict and the state will cease to be. The issue that they debated and that still remains with us is of the role that literature has in the world of practice. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Hope you have enjoyed it well. We shall meet again with a new topic. Till then, take care of your good self. Thank you for watching.